Thank you very much. When I talk about equity management or cap table management in the United States, almost no one comes. So thanks very much for doing that. Can I do a quick, just so I know who I'm talking to, can I do a quick show of hands? How many people here are founders? Great, almost everybody, great. How many people, of the founders, how many of you have raised external capital so far? Okay, so let me do this. I'm going to talk about 3 different things, hopefully over the next 25 minutes. I'm going to start with sort of basics around financings, how financings happen, how we think about dilution, what a cap table is, and then common things that go in a term sheet. So whenever you do an external financing, a financing starts with something that's called a term sheet, which outlines the basic rules of what the financing's going to, what it's going to look like. So let me talk about that. It'll be kind of basic, but it'll really sort of spell out the terms, the definitions that we'll use when we talk about financings. Then I'll talk a little bit about what we do and how we kind of fit into that. And if we have time, I'll show you a quick demo of software and how we translate this into software. So, and please, if you have questions or want me to stop or speed up or skip something, just say so. Raise a hand, please. Okay, so let's talk about a simple financing. So Bob and Mary up here are founders. They decide to split the company. They start a company. They both own 50% of the company. And they decide to invite an investor in, Dave, who's going to invest $1 million into this company. They negotiate what's called a pre-money valuation of $4 million. So Dave says, I'm going to put in $1 million, and I value your company today at 4. So what happens is, this becomes the new cap table after the investment. Dave puts in $1 million, Bob and Mary are worth 4, and the post-money value is called $5 million. And the reason is the day before the financing, everyone agreed that the company was worth $4 million. After Dave puts $1 million into the checking account, it's now worth 4 plus 5. And the reason that Dave owns 20% of this company is he has rights on 1 million of that 5 million, and that's 20%. Okay. Anybody know what kind of financing that's called? Equity financing. So the one on the right, also called a priced round. Okay? There's a different type of financing. I've only been here for 24 hours, and I haven't heard of anybody doing a convertible note, so maybe it doesn't happen here. But in the United States, especially at early stage companies, when you're raising $2 million or less, and it's usually the first capital into the company, they'll do what's called a convertible note, which is really a debt instrument that converts to equity at a future date. And the reason they do this is they avoid the question of what the company is worth today. They're saying, I'm giving you a loan today, and in the future, when somebody else, usually an institutional investor, comes in to price your round, that debt will convert into equity at that price. It's a lot easier for companies to do this at the early stage. The legal fees are a lot lower. It's simpler. And so a lot of early stage companies will do this until they get to an institutional round where they're ready to take on bigger amounts of capital. So I'm going to talk today only about equity financing. And so far, I think that's what's the norm here. But if you ever hear about convertible notes, that's what that is. Okay, so key terms I'm going to say over and over. Pre-money valuation is the value of the company before the money comes in. We typically refer to the investment as new money. So pre-money valuation, what is my company worth before the new money comes in? And then the pre-money plus the new money, by definition, is called the post-money valuation, after the investment valuation. And then the other term I'll use a lot is called the option pool. And this is the reserve pool. These are the reserve number of shares that you're going to keep to give to your employees. Okay. All right, so let's talk about how this works. So same example before. Bob and Mary started a company. They both own 50%. They're doing a pre-money valuation of $4 million. Dave's going to put in $1 million on this. But Dave says, look, if I'm going to invest $1 million, you're going to hire employees. I want you to give them some equity, so you have to reserve what's called a post-money option pool of 20%. So after the investment happens, 20% of the company has to go to employees, is reserved to go to employees at a future date. So the cap table becomes this. Dave still owns his 20%. Remember, he has rights on $1 million of 5, so he owns 20%. But Bob and Mary no longer own 30% of the company each. Or, I'm sorry, 40%. They now own 30% because they've given 10% each to the option pool. We've reserved 20% of the post-money pool worth $1 million to give out to future employees. It's really important to understand that whenever somebody talks about a post-money option pool, the value of that pool comes out of the founders or of the cap table prior to the financing. A lot of people don't understand, well, hey, who really pays for this? It is the founders, the current investors in the company that pay for the post-money option pool. So when you go to negotiate a term sheet, one of the things you will negotiate is what's the post-money option pool going to be? How much are we going to reserve for employees? It is a zero-sum game of which you and your future investors have opposite interests. He wants a higher pool because he wants you to give more incentive to your employees. You want a lower pool because you have to pay for it. It is the largest negotiation point for most financings, especially early stage. Okay, what if you already have an option pool? So let's say Bob and Mary said, look, I'm going to create an option pool even before I talk to the investors. So they create this option pool pre-financing worth 20%. So what will the post-money option pool be after the financing? Well, everybody gets diluted down 20% because Dave puts in $1 million for 20% of the company. So the option pool gets reduced by 20% as well. So the post-money option pool is now 16%. Okay. So it's reduced just like everything else. But what if instead Dave says, you know what, I don't want a post-money option pool of 16%. I want you to have a post-money of 20%. So Bob and Mary already have a 20%, but they know it gets diluted, and they want a target of a post-money of 20% after the financing. So what that means is this is what the cap table looks like. Bob and Mary own 30%. The option pool is worth 20% or $1 million, and Dave keeps his 20% for $1 million for 20%. You notice it's no different than when Bob and Mary didn't have an option pool. It's exactly the same after the financing. It's another key point to remember. A lot of times we've seen founders say, well, I'll just do the option pool first, and then it won't dilute. And it actually doesn't matter at all whether you have an option pool before the financing or after. All that matters, the only number that matters when you talk to an investor about the option pool is the post money. What you have today is irrelevant. All right. So what if Bob and Mary, instead of just taking Dave as an investor, they invite Ann in, and Ann's going to put in $1 million. So now they're going to raise $2 million, same pre-money on a $4 million valuation. How much of the company does Ann own? 20%? It's actually 16.666. She has rights on $1 million of a post of 6. Because remember, the pre-money was 4. The second after the financing, the company now has an additional $2 million of fresh capital in their bank account. So the company is worth 4 plus 2. So the post money is $6 million, of which Ann has rights of $1 million on that 6, or approximately 17%. Okay? The more money you raise, the more dilution you have, the less of the post money cap table you own. So Bob and Mary now have 27% instead of 30% of the company. That's called dilution. Okay, so let's make it more difficult. So Bob and Mary, same thing, 40%, pre-money of 4. They want a post-money option pool of 15%. Dave decides he wants 20% of the company. He doesn't care how much it costs. He's price indifferent, and this is true for most institutional investors. When you raise from a venture-backed institution, by prospectus, most of them have to own a certain amount of the company. And they'll say, look, I want to own, Bob and Mary, I want to own 20% of your company. You tell me how much money I have to put in. Ann is different. Ann's an angel investor, and she just does a fixed amount per company. So she says, I'm just going to put in $500K. You tell me how much of the company that's worth. And then Jeff is kind of in the middle. He's like, I want 5% of the company, but I'm only willing to spend up to $400K. So if 5% is less than $400K, tell me how much that is. If it's more, I'm just putting in $400K, tell me what percentage I own. Okay? So this is pretty hard to do right. This is usually done in Excel. And then what happens is when you negotiate with investors, there's 2 primary levers that you negotiate with. One is the post-money option pool that we discussed, and the other is the pre-money. So Bob and Mary would say, oh, hey, we actually want a pre-money of $5 million. And the investors would say, no, pre-money of $3 million, and it goes back and forth. And each time you go back, everyone has to model what the post-money cap table will look like in the new financing under these rules. That spreadsheet about what the post-money cap table will look like, it's called a pro forma. Typically, it's what your lawyer will use when they do a financing. It's the key document. Everything revolves around the pro forma. Everything's about the pro forma. Whenever you start a new financing, the first thing they'll do is build a pro forma for you. All right. Any questions so far? All right. Great. Okay. So let's go back to our simplest example. This is our first example, the simplest. Bob and Mary own 50% each, pre-money valuation of 4, no option pool. As simple as it can get. Dave puts in $1 million. So this is the pro forma, and let's imagine it just did the financing, so this is the new cap table. Let's sell the company. So Bob and Mary, they do great, and they go sell. A year later, they sell the company for $10 million. How much money does Dave get? Guess? $2 million, right? Because he owns 20% of the company. Pretty simple. Bob and Mary both get 4. It's a great outcome. Okay, easy. Just divide by the percentage. That's what it means to own a percentage of the company, is when it gets paid out, you get that percentage. Let's say they didn't do so great. So a year later, it's an acqui-hire. So they sell for $500K. How much does Dave make? Sorry? Exactly. And almost, maybe it's different here, but all venture capital investment in the United States is on a preferred basis, which is exactly right. So Dave will get 500, and Bob and Mary will get 0. Okay? This difference is what's called a preferred class of stock. Okay? All venture investment is done on a preferred class of stock, and this is called a liquidation preference. It means that they are preferred stock in case of liquidation. Liquidation means we sell a company. Preferred stock gets paid before anybody else. And that's why he makes $500K in this case. Okay, so I want to talk about that specifically, that specific economic instrument in a little more detail, because it's fundamental to everything about financings in venture. So let me take a quick excursion to accounting. So if everyone remembers, the fundamental law of accounting is assets equals liabilities plus equity, right? And as a reminder from accounting course, think of it this way. The total worth of the company minus everything that they owe has to be equal to shareholder equity. That's what's left for the owners. This is why this law is true. That's the intuition. Okay. So if assets equals liabilities plus equity, the other fundamental rule of accounting is that in case of a liquidation, debts are always paid before shareholder equity. Debt is always paid before equity. Okay? So that's how we understand capital structures. On the left side, I have the company value, the total assets. Let's say it's $100, and then I have liabilities plus equity. Remember, assets equals liabilities plus equity. And this is a capital structure of this company. And if suddenly, for some reason, the value of the company goes down to $80, it wipes out the equity, because equity is paid after debt. And it's only at that point that if the assets go down to 60, do the debt holders take a cut? Is liabilities affected? Okay? That's fundamentally the difference between debt and equity. So you can draw a payout graph based on that phenomenon. So here, if the sales price on the bottom axis is if the bottom axis is the sales price of the company, then the payout is on the y-axis. So in the debt example here, everything gets paid up to $80 directly to debt, and then after that, it's nothing. Assume no interest for the moment, for simplicity. After that, debt doesn't get anything. They're made whole. The flip side is equity. Nothing gets paid out on equity until $80, and then everything gets paid to equity after that. Okay. So in this example of Bob and Mary, what's interesting about these two examples is in this case, David's preferred stock acts like equity. But in this case, David's preferred stock acts like debt. That's what makes it preferred stock. It has this hybrid quality. It actually acts like debt when it's in Dave's interest, and it acts like equity when it's in Dave's interest. So that means for Bob and Mary, we can do an equivalent payout graph with these two different instruments. So this is Bob and Mary's equity instrument. We have $0 to $1 million. They don't get paid anything because that's acting like debt now on the preferred stock class. And then between 1 and 5, they get everything. And then after 5, there's this kink. Why does that kink happen? Guess? It's because this is the point that Dave converts his preferred class into equity, into common equity, and he starts to share the proceeds. From 1 to 5, it's still acting like debt. So that's why Bob and Mary get everything. After that, he converts it to equity, and he gets his 20%. And so that's why the slope reduces. In fact, the slope is the equivalent of how much of the company Bob and Mary own. So then Dave has a preferred class stock that looks like this. Between 0 and 1, he gets all of it. Between 0 and 1 million, because it's acting like debt. Between 1 and 5, he just keeps his 1 million. Nothing changes. But as soon as he hits 5, as soon as he hits that kink in the graph, he'll convert it to common, and he'll take his 20%. Okay. Sorry. So if you're Dave... So most of you are founders. Think about it from an investor perspective. If you're Dave, what don't you like about this graph? Well, obviously nobody likes losing. What else? This is okay. The biggest problem is here. Okay. Between 0 to 1, it's a well understood problem. Dave just collects his money back just like it was a debt instrument. After 5 million, success solves all problems, right? He's just collecting his money and everything's great. All of the tension in a term sheet negotiation is around what happens if there's a middle outcome. If the company doesn't go to 0 and the company's not successful, what happens? Because from Dave's perspective, he's saying, look, I gave you $1 million of cash, right? At a post of 5, you had $1 million of cash today, and then 2 years later, your company is worth less. How is that possible, right? And the only thing I get back, I took all of that risk. The only thing I get back is $1 million for giving you that cash, and you did nothing with it. All of the term sheet negotiations that you will go into are all about solving this problem, because nobody has a complaint here, and from here, it's just, it acts like debt. There's no money to complain about. There's no money to fight over. All term sheet negotiations are around what to do in the middle outcome. So, there's a lot of different ways that term sheets will try to solve this problem, but let me give you 3 of the most common, at least in the US. And these are becoming more common now with the venture slowdown. So, the first one's called accruing dividends. So these are dividends that get paid out by the preferred stock, but because, of course, these companies don't have cash, that's why they raise money in the first place, they accrue stock against their class of stock. So instead of getting 6% of cash, they'll get 6% in the form of stock. So their percentage of the cap table will increase at a rate of, let's say, 6% per year. It's called accruing dividends. Another one is called participating preferred. So that says, look, I'm not going to wait. If we close this round at a post money of 5, I'm not going to wait till you hit 5 million to start taking my pro rata. I want it to start as soon as you clear 1 million. So as soon as you hit 1 million, as soon as you hit what's called the lick pref, which is what you owe me, I want to be able to convert to equity and take my share. And then the third one is the most blunt, and it just says, look, I'm giving you $1 million. You owe me $2 million back before you can take anything. That's it. The liquidation preference is called a 2x liquidation preference in that case. You owe me 2 times what you borrowed from me. Okay. So let's look at this payout graph now in terms of accruing dividends. So the question is, if this is a normal clean transaction, how does this change if we have accruing dividends. It's a little difficult. I did my best shot at it. It's a little difficult to see this in 3 dimensions, but the idea is that over time, the liquidation preference grows, and it grows at approximately 6% per year. So Dave put in $1 million. A year later, the liquidation preference, the amount of debt that he gets back, is $1,060,000. Okay? So they have to pay back $1,060,000 before common holders get any money. Okay? And each year it just gets bigger and bigger. Okay, participating preferred. So remember, participating preferred means that Dave doesn't have to wait till you hit 5 million. When he will convert and start taking his equity piece, he gets to get it right at 1. So that changes it. That moves the kink in the graph over to the $1 million bucket like this. And so you'll see for David, the kink starts there. He starts to earn, even at $2 million, he starts getting a return. And you'll see Bob and Mary down here, their curve goes down and it starts earlier. I should have mentioned that I did these in increasing level of in the favor of the investor. So the first one, this is actually this is the most founder-friendly of the 3 examples. This is the second. And the reason this isn't so bad is in the case of a successful outcome, this asymptotically just goes back to the normal clean deal. Because out here, it really doesn't matter where the starting point, right? If it sells for $100 million, nobody cares. You can't even tell. It's a rounding error. This only affects if something happens in the middle. Okay? And then the most severe of the 3 examples is the preferred multiplier. And this says, as a reminder, this says take the liquidation preference of 1 million and multiply it by, let's say, 2. And so all that does is increase the debt liquidation preference by whatever factor. And so you have to pay David $2 million before Bob and Mary can collect. Okay. So those are the 3 most common. So if you get into a term sheet negotiation with an institutional venture capital, these will be the 3 most common terms that you'll see, the levers that they'll use during the negotiation. A few more terms. I won't go into these in detail, but just to give you, in case you run into it, these are relatively common terms. So anti-dilution, it's very common at the kind of Series A level when you start getting into larger institutional rounds. And what that really means is if the company does a down round, so down round means I raise money at a lower valuation than I raised previously. It's a down round because my value is lower. This protects the investor from being diluted. So, from their viewpoint, it's, hey, I gave you $1 million at a post money of 5, and then you worked for 2 years, and then you raise another $1 million at a post of 3. That's not really fair to me. You actually did worse when I gave you money. So I need to be protected on my dilution, and that's called anti-dilution. And effectively, it gives them more shares in the post money on the next round. Okay? Usually when that happens, it's really bad for the company because it gets paid for by the management team. It's a zero, all this financing, it's a zero-sum game, and somebody has to pay for it, and it's usually the founders. Another one is warrants. I don't know if venture debt is very popular here, but in the United States, larger companies, after kind of Series A financings, larger companies can get debt, what's called venture debt, and effectively it's a loan. It's a true loan with interest, but because it's high-risk loan, the banks will usually require warrants. It's also used in some financings where founders will use a warrant as a kicker to incentivize an investor to move quickly. For those of you that have raised money, you certainly know this dynamic. Right, when you first start raising, nobody happens. And then as soon as you get a few going, the momentum increases, and very quickly the rounds close. And so the hardest part of a financing is to get the first few investors to move. And so what some founders will do is say, look, if you're the first investor to move, I'll give you warrants. I'll give you an extra amount of shares, and that will get them to move, and then hopefully everyone will start to follow. It very much is a bunch of people standing around waiting for the first person to jump in. And a warrant it's like an option. It's a right to buy stock, but it's dilutive, which means that it increases the dilution of the cap table, where options typically do not. And then the last one is partially participating liquidation preference. So it behaves like a participating preferred, but it's expressed as a multiplier. So it'll say, if you remember our curve, instead of starting at $1 million, it'll say, look, from $1 to $2 million, you just pay me my liquidation preference, but starting at 2, I want to be able to convert. And it's sort of a halfway between a multiplier and participating preferred. So it's a hybrid version. All right, so let me talk about, any questions, on financing terms and how capital structures work? Yeah.
Can I just ask a question on convertible debt?
Sure.
There's an instrument called the SAFE. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that differs from convertible debt?
Sure. So the SAFE was created, I guess, 2 or 3 years ago by YC. And effectively, it operates a lot like a note, but it doesn't have interest and any of those sort of like the stuff that goes with debt that creates tax issues and interest rates and all of these things. But it effectively acts like a note, and it just says, hey, it's a right to buy at the next round price. So they don't have to price the company today. And they'll usually put in things just like they will in a convertible debt instrument. They'll put in incentives for the investor, because why would they put in money for a future price that they don't know? And they'll include things like, hey, it's a 20% discount on the next round price, and often they'll also include a cap. So they'll say if it's more than 20 million, the cap is 20 million. So if it's more than $20 million pre, you pay at most $20 million, or a price per share at $20 million. Anything else on that stuff? Yeah.
I have 2 questions. The first one, is there a standard option pool level nowadays? And are the methods can be combined to protect the investors?
Sorry, what was the second one? What can be combined?
The methods like, for example, anti-dilution combined with investment multipliers can be combined together to protect the investors.
Sure, great question. Both of them. So these days, what we typically see for option pool, and it changes slightly on the stage of the company, and usually the pool gets smaller as the company gets bigger. But typically what we'll see is somewhere between 8 to 12%. The more generous companies might be 15%. So I think on our, we raised a Series B last summer, and it was an 8% pool. And then the round before that, our A, I think, was a 10% pool. So, and then about combining them, they certainly can be combined. Anti-dilution is pretty standard and doesn't affect the current deal. It's sort of like a future protection. I think usually you won't see a multiplier and a dividend. That's a pretty draconian kind of double hit, but it's certainly possible. Yeah.
Yeah. Hello. Good evening. Coming back to the SAFE, how popular is it in the US? What do you think?
We don't see it too often outside YC. It seems to be very popular with YC. It happens a little bit outside. 500 Startups has their version called a KISS, which is more common with 500 startups. The most common that we see is convertible debt. I think the second most would be Series Seed documents. So if you go to seriesseed.com, it's a standardized set of seed documents. So there's sort of this competition around what's the easiest, cheapest way to do a financing. And there's like SAFE and convertible debt, and the equity people are doing Series Seed docs, which is like really standard, simple seed docs that don't do anything about board, seats, or anything like that. And then I guess, so I think it's somewhere around debt, seed docs, safe, and then maybe KISS.
Sorry, but I'm still not very clear about the difference between a safe and a convertible note. What is the core difference between the two?
There's almost no
It's
difference.
same.
Economically, they're exactly the same. There's no interest with a safe. That's the big difference. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, thank you. And there's no maturity date. And that's a key piece where in practice it never happens, where because debt has to have a maturity date. In theory, an investor can call the debt and bankrupt the company, and a safe does not. In practice, no one calls a debt because there's no money to call from. But yeah. All right. Anything else? Okay. Let me jump into us a little bit. So now that we got some basic kind of terminology, let me talk about sort of what we do and how we fit into that system. So this won't mean much to you guys, but in the United States, we're what's called an SEC registered transfer agent. So in the public world, when you buy stock in a public market exchange, there's literally somebody with there's a company. Usually in France, it's a bank. In the United States, it's called a transfer agent. But there's some large financial institution that's responsible for knowing that you bought 100 shares of Google, for example. There's this database, in a big server room somewhere that says, oh, Bob bought 100 shares of Google from Mary. Okay, it's called a transfer agent. We are a transfer agent for private companies. So all of the public companies have it. The private companies actually don't until eShares. They all do this on paper. So if you guys have a cap table today, and I learned this today. You guys, maybe you don't know this, maybe you do. You guys are supposed to have a stamped book called your share ledger, which tracks all of your shareholders in your company. We have in the United States, it's not a stamped book, it's usually Excel. But that is taking the place of a transfer agent, and that's what we do. So we are the software version of that, where we track the share registry, okay? The cap table. So what that means is that we do the issuance and compliance around issuing electronic stock, options, warrants, debt, any type of security for the company. So companies come to us, they get set up, we issue stock, it goes through our compliance workflow. For example, if it's a Delaware company, the president and the secretary have to sign the stock certificate before it's issued to the shareholder. The shareholder then gets an email with a secure token. They click on this token, they sign for the shares, and the shares are deposited into their eShares account, kind of like PayPal. So what happens is, because we automate this issuance, we know all of the liabilities of the company, every line item in the cap table, and we also know the entire portfolio of the investor. So the investor will get all of their securities. It looks just like a brokerage statement for them. And then the company gets to see all the liabilities, aka their cap table. What are all the shares that they've sold? And this is kind of what it looks like. So you have, on one side, you have a cap table. These are all the stock certificates that have been issued. We track things like vesting. I'm sure all of you guys have vested stock for founders. And then on this side, we have the portfolio, which is the equivalent of here. So this is the stock that got issued, and this is the stock that got purchased. Okay. And what's unique about what we do is, and this is sort of US specific, but I think it's not too different here, maybe different companies. But in the public world, if you take a company public, your share registry goes to the transfer agent. Your option plan administration, it's actually different. Your options for your employees go to the brokerage house. And then your settlement platform, i.e. how you exchange shares when they get purchased, go to one of the exchanges. So Euronext, right? ICE. So in the public world, this kind of separates into different platforms, and it becomes very complicated. In the private world, we have this sort of unique opportunity, which is we can combine all of these functions, the transfer of stock, the tracking of stock options, and then also the clearing of secondary purchases all in one platform. Great, that was it for me. Any questions?
How do you integrate, or do you integrate with the actual documents? So with the safe, et cetera.
But yeah, so what happens is when we set the company up, we load up all of the documents, the equity option plan, the stock purchase agreements, all of those documents get loaded up. And so when you issue new option grants or new securities, part of the workflow is signing the documents online. So we do e-signatures online, and everyone signs the documents, and those documents get attached to the security. So when the investor or you can log in, you can look at the security, you can see all the documents attached to it.
But how do you know the documents are conforming?
Tell me about conforming.
Let us say there's a mistake in one of the documents.
In
Or
the sorry, go ahead.
in the original signed document, which purports to be a safe that has et cetera, but actually there's something different about it.
So for existing documents, part of our onboarding process is actually a reconciliation against the documents. So we actually literally, I hate to say it, but we literally have like a team of paralegals that will go through and read documents and make sure it matches up before we go live. Because once we're live, this becomes the master system of record. For new documents, the lawyers are usually, we're kind of out of that. It's the lawyers that decide which, they'll review the documents, certify the documents, certify the documents and upload them. Yeah. Well, to do the documents is manual, yeah.
And there could be a discrepancy, but there could be a discrepancy between the two.
Yeah, I mean, I think in practice, the discrepancy is usually not, I got the wrong document. The discrepancy is usually, I got the wrong number.
Okay, but the text tends to be fine, or so far that's been your experience?
Yeah, I mean,
what I'm asking really is whether or not an automated integration of the document generation and the deal terms, the mathematical expression of the economic deal, would make sense.
Yeah, so the way that we the model that we use, or the paradigm, is we actually, all the economic information we track, and then all the non-economic information goes into the documents. And so it's true, I guess, that we could be, or the lawyers could be incorrect on the text documents. Hopefully, it's not true that it's wrong in the data, because then it'd be very obvious that your cap table is wrong. So, I mean, I guess lawyers do make a lot of mistakes. Yeah. Oh, you're a lawyer. There you go. Yeah. Fortunately, we save a lot of the numbers errors, which tend to be the worst kind.
Looks great. Yeah, thanks. This tool looks great, especially when you have shareholders around the world, which is our case. So they'll be able to connect online and check that document.
So you have 5 employees. How many investors?
15.
15. So we'll categorize you. We price in terms of stakeholders, which is employees plus investors. So we'd say you were a 20 stakeholder company. So how much would you pay?
Well,
you won't insult me. You can go really low.
Okay. No, I would appreciate a special price.
I'm sure we can work that out. Yeah.
I assume that you do better on next rounds when we are richer as a startup.
Yeah.
But I don't have any clue at this stage. I would say that early stage is money is really, let's say, useful for us.
Yep.
To put it at work.
So you would be at a 20 person. I think you would be. Is it $150 a month? Yeah. So you would pay $50 a month.
Okay.
Does that seem? I'm trying to do price discovery in Europe. Does that seem reasonable?
Yeah, we can talk about it.
You can totally pay for that?
Let's
so we underpriced.
Let's have a chat.
Okay, great. Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. We actually just went through this whole pricing exercise, and we changed our pricing recently. If anybody's going to go through that, come grab me. Happy to share the horror stories. It's very hard to change pricing on customers well. So talk to me, I'll tell you how not to do it. But we actually changed our pricing, and what's interesting about our pricing is, to your point, normally you think of economies of scale, like it becomes less expensive per user. Our pricing actually gets more expensive per user, and it's part because startups are very cash constrained, and we want to be helpful and support the younger companies, but also the complexity of the problem goes up considerably once you get past 50 to 100 employees. We're working with BlaBlaCar, and their cap table is huge. So, and they pay a lot more than $50 a month. So, yeah.
So, what proportion of your clientele, primary client, are investors, and what proportion are startups? So, do investors come to you directly as well?
Yeah, so we have an interesting we kind of fit into this sort of ecosystem in an interesting way. Our customer is the company, so you guys pay us. Our power user is actually the lawyer. So in a typical model, you will decide, hey, I'm going to use eShares for my company, and then you call your lawyer and say, use eShares for my company. And then the lawyer uses us to manage your cap table. And the reason you do that is it's way cheaper than paying them to, keep track of the ledger and print all these documents. And if there's a mistake, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. We don't charge the law firms at all. So they just use it. And then the investors will get the shares, and then they log in, and they also use it. So we have sort of 3 points of contact to kind of complete the circle. And the investors today, angel investors do not pay, or most investors do not pay, but we actually have a portfolio management product that we sell just to institutional funds, large venture capital funds like, Andreessen, Sequoia, those kinds of companies. And then those guys will pay, but it's a premium feature. But our primary business, 95% of our revenue right now is from companies.
And what's, I'm sorry I missed the introduction, but what's your interest in this presentation? I mean, is this your foray into Europe? And how are you seeing deals happening over here versus in the US? And you mentioned the slowdown in the US, but how's the market looking over here?
Yeah, sure. So this is totally a foray. It's our kind of first trip as a company here. And what happened was we've been operating for a little over 2 years, about 26 months in the U.S. We're growing very quickly. We put on about 200 companies a month. We raised about $26 million to date. So we're doing well in the U.S. And then what happened was sort of unintentionally, we closed BlaBlaCar in one fine stay. As sort of two, and it was really interesting because in the United States, as I told you, we had to build our business bottom up, right? We started with the smallest, just two founders in a garage and kind of worked our way up. In Europe, we were like starting at the top and then kind of like working our way down. So we decided with those two companies, we're in sales cycles with a couple of other large companies. And so this was our first trip to go meet these companies, learn more about how the regulatory requirements are different here than in the US, and make sure that we're meeting all the regulatory stuff, and then do some business development. So this is business development. This is, hopefully, some of you will say, oh, maybe this can help me save legal bills. This would be kind of cool to use. You guys will come on. We'll get to know you. We'll work with you. You'll tell us what you like and don't like about the product. We'll adapt it accordingly. And then I think there will be sort of some inflection point where we'll just decide, look, we really got to go attack Europe more aggressively. Okay, great. Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate the time. Thank you.
Girl, I'm from